Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Alex McLevy.
Against all odds, the fabled Zack Snyder cut of Justice League is now available on HBO Max. In honor of this unlikely occasion, we're looking back on the franchise containing this supersized superhero movie, the DCEU. How do the films hold up, and how do they compare to those of crosstown rival Marvel? We'll get into that and more on a special Cape and Cowl edition of the podcast.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, welcome again, folks, to Film Club. Thank you for joining us here today. This is the part of the show normally where Katie Rife and I would probably banter a little bit and do some boring talk about the weather or maybe the fact that we are still in a pandemic. But my co-host Katie Rife is not here today. She is actually covering the virtual edition of the South by Southwest Film Festival. Very busy with that. So I have a special guest on today, and I would like to please join me in welcoming our special guest, and that's Alex McLevy. How you doing, Alex?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on today to talk about all things comic book.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so you're kind of you've been with the AV Club for probably like 7 years now?
Yeah, almost 6 years.
Wow. Yeah. And you have kind of, I don't know through choice or if you've just sort of fallen into this role, you've become somebody on staff who can write about comic book media. Not necessarily a lot about comic books themselves, but a lot about the adaptations of various comics.
Yeah, I sort of fell backwards into that area that became an expertise. I think just because I started writing about some of the TV adaptations and then, by extension, just sort of naturally, given especially the whole interconnected mission of all of these big franchise properties at this point, it only made sense to start talking about the films as well.
Well, you're also very good. I mean, as a staff writer for the site, you're also very good at coming up with these kind of on-the-fly theses that you need to have for a piece about something new. And the fact of the matter is comic book movies dominate so much of the cultural conversation now. They are the biggest movies that Hollywood makes. And now with things like WandaVision, they've sort of taken over television as well. So it sort of makes sense that you would occasionally have to walk that beat, right?
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, to be fair also, I mean, I think these things, they get a lot of shit that's fair, I think, thrown their way. But also, it's always interesting to me when something is this big and influences the culture so significantly. I mean, that's inherently interesting to me.
I agree. I actually do think they're worthy of conversation, and that maybe that's a larger conversation about comic book cinema. I know a lot of our peers do not value these films, and I understand.
They sure do not.
And I understand that a lot of them are kind of machine tooled in some ways and feel like assembly line product, which is probably one of my bigger issues with a lot of them. But I do think that as cultural phenomena, that they are interesting and that there is stuff to discuss in them.
Yeah, exactly. That above and beyond their individual qualities as films, there's just interesting texture to them as contributions to pop culture at large.
Very much so. So today we are going to be talking about the DCEU, and that is the franchise of films that has been running since 2013, starring the DC's line of superheroes, basically. So Superman, Batman, Aquaman, Wonder Woman. That whole line of characters. The film started in 2013 with Man of Steel, Zack Snyder's sort of introduction to this new take on the character and this new take on the DC universe. And since we've had 8 years of films that have followed it, they are in order: Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, Justice League, Aquaman, Shazam, Birds of Prey, Wonder Woman 1984, and now obviously this week, the Zack Snyder cut of Justice League. That's the much fabled Snyder cut that fans have been clamoring for really almost since Justice League hit theaters in 2017. Finally a reality, finally available on HBO Max. Let's start by saying, are you a fan of these films at all?
That's yeah. I think fan might be too strong a word for it. I'm somebody who's always interested in these films, especially given how sort of idiosyncratic they are in comparison to the Marvel movies, which I think, you've talked a lot about on this podcast. There's sort of people have this sort of factory style of Marvel movie making. There's a very set style, there's a very set visual dynamic for the most part. Those films adhere to a sort of tried and true formula, whereas the DCEU films are really much more all over the map, I think, in terms of quality and texture and aesthetics and all of that.
Very much so, I would agree. And I think a part of that is that this has been a fundamentally reactive franchise in some ways. And I think we're going to get into that a little bit more later in the episode. But it's been a bumpy franchise, too. And in terms of both reviews, which have been generally not as strong as the reviews for Marvel films, and the box office has been kind of inconsistent as well. I mean, you've kind of seen highs and lows. None of these films have been outright flops, but something like Justice League, the 2017 cut of Justice League, is considered a failure because it did not meet the expectations of its studio, Warner Brothers. The fact of the matter is comic book movies cost a lot of money, and there is often a lot riding on them,
Yeah, well, and not only that, but I think a big part of it is that all of the sort of what you'd consider "quote unquote" maybe the key films of the DCEU have all been sort of critically maligned to a greater or lesser degree. That's largely the Zack Snyder films, Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, and then of course Justice League, which is of course its own beast. But these are movies that really set the tone for the DCEU, and so it's always been a bit of a sticky wicket where I feel like DC's always had a bit of a chip on its shoulder because right out of the gate they were already struggling in a way that Marvel never was.
Yes, I agree. And I think that talking about it as a reactive franchise is again, something we're going to talk about because I think that their relationship to Marvel is not incidental. I think that it has driven some of the decisions that have been made, both in terms of contrast and in terms of emulation. We should note, too, that Joker, which is probably the most... I don't know if I would say the most critically acclaimed. I think actually probably Wonder Woman is probably the most critically acclaimed of this franchise. Joker, though, is the most... I guess you'd say the most prestigious, having won the top prize both at Venice. Having won the top prize at Venice and then, last year received a number of Academy Award nominations as well. Joker is not part of the DCEU. It's one of many offshoots of this franchise that are coming increasingly down the pike. There's another Batman movie that's coming out. Well, with the pandemic, who knows exactly when it's coming out. I think right now it's scheduled for sometime next year. That movie will also not be a part of this established universe that they've created. But the films we are talking about today are all within the same continuity, the ones set up by Man of Steel.
Yeah, exactly. And also I think important to note, right, is that these films came out in the wake of some of the most massively critically and commercially successful DC films, which was, of course, the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy.
That is very important to note. And I think that there is some Nolan in them, to be honest, which obviously Nolan was involved on a producer level on Man of Steel. Goyer, who worked on Batman Begins with Nolan, was one of the screenwriters on Man of Steel. So there is some Nolan DNA in these films, but they're very distinctive from Christopher Nolan's films as well. I think they operate in a totally different way than Nolan's films, which, Nolan, I think his whole thing was like, let's ground the Batman mythos in some semblance of reality, especially by the second film in that series. Which, by the way, folks, if you're interested, Katie and I talked about the Batman trilogy last summer when we were doing a Christopher Nolan series, so that's available as well. You can hear my terrible takes on those as well. But the Snyder films, I think, have distinguished themselves from the Nolan films in that they do not necessarily take place in anything in that same, again, marginally more grounded world. I mean, if you look at something like Batman Begins, this is still a comic book universe, obviously. But in the Nolan films, they are attempting to resemble our reality a little bit more than they are in Snyder's films. Yeah,
exactly. I think Zack Snyder is nothing if not someone who's sort of proven that he has very little interest in keeping things grounded in some sort of recognizable reality.
Very true. So what's your personal history with these characters? Did you grow up reading DC Comics?
I did, yeah. I was I usually describe myself as a full-on Marvel kid, but I was steeped in DC from well before that, thanks to I think probably the same way a lot of people did, older siblings. I was maybe only 8 or 9 years old when I took the Dark Knight Returns graphic novel from my brother's room and read it, which,
Oh, wow.
That's an early age, I think, maybe for something as bleak as the Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller's famously sort of nihilistic, bleak Batman graphic novel. But so that sort of launched me into, going through everything in his room, then reading all those comics, sort of, getting into Green Lantern and a lot of these other guys. So I was pretty well versed in it. In fact, one of the reasons I then chose Marvel was just as a way to have my own superheroes as a kid, so that I wasn't just this nerd kid reading his brother's comics. I was a nerd kid reading his own nerd comics.
That's like when you discover your own band, you like grow up listening to your older brother or older cousin's music or something, and then eventually you find a band where you're like, that's going to be my band.
Yeah, exactly.
Got them on my own. But so you were kind of an agnostic in the sense that you went across the spectrum.
Yeah, I was never one of those people who thought it was important to, come down on one side or the other. I had very little interest in those sort of partisan games. But I know you I mean, in that way, you were sort of similar to me, right? You were a bit of a comics kid growing up as well, right?
I was, and I was more of a Marvel kid, for sure. I mean, I grew up reading X-Men was the thing that I read the most as a kid, and then I dipped into other stuff like Spider-Man and Hulk, but I read some DC as well. I read some Batman certainly during the early '90s. That was a big time to be a Batman fan, both with. Mm-hmm. With the Burton movies out and with the Batman the Animated Series out. So I ended up knowing a lot of the DC heroes from like other media, cartoon series, or I grew up watching the Superman films as well. So I was more of a Marvel kid, but I don't think I ever really staked a side in that either. I mean, the other thing was that I grew up reading Wizard magazine, and so even if you weren't reading every book religiously, Wizard was giving you a sense of what was going on in these separate worlds.
Yeah. For people who don't know, that's basically like the Sports Illustrated of the comic books.
It really is, down to there being basically swimsuit spreads for the fictional characters.
Right. God, I forgot about that. Yeah, that's right.
You'd get like Rogue in a bikini or something, on the inside of it. Yeah, I mean, having grown up in the early '90s, I sort of grew up in what I now understand to be sort of a bad era for comic books, but at the time was very exciting. It was that boom and bust period where everything was selling big until it wasn't. And, tons of crossover events, tons of variant covers. And everybody at that time was racing to... I mean, you had the Superman dies storyline in the early 90s, and then it felt like every other major comic after that, at least of the big mainstream comic companies, was chasing that kind of event. They wanted their own Superman dies,
Absolutely, yeah. And that's sort of, that's how I can sort of prove my bona fides, right? Is I remember I had the big poster on my wall of the "Where were you when Superman died?" From that when that happened.
That's very funny. So we both have some background with these films, or with these characters, and with these worlds. And again, as somebody who is often in a position where I'm reviewing these movies, I always find it a little funny when I get anyone telling me that, because I sort of feel like I fall in the middle on them a little bit, because I will get, occasionally we will get people lashing out at us online because we didn't like a particular movie or something. Very strong with comic book culture and comic book movie culture right now. In fact, my review of the Zack Snyder cut is on the website, and as we are recording this, I'm already getting the first of my angry reactions online to it. And the reality is that I think that I am sometimes hard on these movies, but also at heart, I'm still a comic book kid. There's still a part of me that's a comic book kid. And I think that watching these films, I often find myself in this sort of battle to reconcile the part of me that still gets a real kick out of comic book storytelling and the part of me that resists the direction that comic book movies have gone over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I've spoken with other critics about this too, who grew up as sort of comic book loving kids, and there is something sort of fascinating about the way you try and reconcile your sort of critical instincts with first of all, there's this sort of generalized nostalgia that I think a lot of people have for these characters, whether you were a comic book reader or not. But then on top of that, if you were, and if you're sort of at least somewhat steeped in these worlds, you have an additional sort of thrill or desire to see, precisely those sort of, those things that you had in your head for so long, those splash pages come to life, those, those character conflicts that so well play out on screen in front of you. It's an interesting sort of thing to sort of grapple with as you deal with these films.
It's tricky in some ways, and I feel like I'm constantly negotiating it when writing about these films. But going back to the DCEU, which is the topic at hand today, I think it is important to note how reactive this franchise has been in a lot of ways. Yeah. Because, when the first film came out in 2013, when Man of Steel came out, Marvel was in full swing at that point. We had already seen, at that point, the Avengers had been the previous summer from Man of Steel. So Marvel was already, it was basically had already successfully pulled off this crossover strategy that it was pulling with these films. They already knew that what they were doing was something that people liked and that was popular. And so DC, in some respects, could respond to what had been working with Marvel, even as something like Man of Steel was being made before they had any idea that The Avengers was going to be the hit that it was. But the writing was kind of on the wall. And I feel like those early films, especially Man of Steel, to me felt like a reaction to Marvel, both in the sense that they were designed to be fundamentally darker. It was like Marvel is the light, childish side of this spectrum. We're doing something much darker and more quote-unquote adult. But at the same time, you could tell from the very start that they wanted to imitate the kind of lucrative shared universe approach, right? I mean, the second film in the franchise is Batman v Superman. They're already setting up Justice League at that point, Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think that is something that doesn't always get enough attention with that, is the fact that from the start, DC thought of themselves, and I think in large part, as we discussed before, thanks to the success of the Nolan Batman trilogy, there was this idea, I mean, those were so, critically and commercially successful for the most part, that there was this idea, we're the better version. We can do the serious one. We don't need lighthearted, family-friendly jokes all the time. We can do the sort of more grown-up, adult themed superhero movies. And so that, to me, that really felt like it from the start. And you're absolutely right then that of course that doesn't negate the fact that did they want that shared universe, so much so that they were willing to, I think, jettison early plans. I think that, you can read they had initially planned to sort of do Man of Steel 2, but they jumped ahead because of the reactive nature of this franchise.
I do wonder how much Zack Snyder was involved in that idea, because when we talk about the DCEU, I mean, he's kind of the one name that you have to talk about when you talk about these movies. He was so instrumental to setting the tone of these films, to setting the look of them, and to setting the course in a way that I think DC might regret at this point in some ways, honestly. And I wonder how much he was interested in emulating that Marvel plan. If it had been up to Snyder, would we have seen more films that were essentially just standalone, or at least sequels in the sense of what they used to look like in a comic book universe, less trying to tie everybody together and create these branches out from one franchise hub, and more just saying, what could we do in a second Man of Steel movie? What could we do in a third? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think he's sort of, and his films, I think, represent this very well. If you watch, Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and now his new cut of Justice League, that he seems to have very little interest in the wider interconnected universe, but he's deeply invested in the interconnectedness of his own films.
For sure.
That he's very interested in playing and sort of telling his story on the largest sort of template or tapestry he can paint. So that he. The movies as they progress, I think he has no desire to let go of the idea that he's always, in a sense, excited about the next story as he's telling the current one.
Well, because, I mean, and also all of his films for the DCU, all of Zack Snyder's films, lead into the next, in a sense, because they all feel like reactions to what came before. Again, highly reactive franchise, even within itself, in the sense that Batman v Superman is built around, to some respect, the response that people had to Man of Steel. I mean, Man of Steel, for those who don't remember, basically ends with Superman leveling a lot of Metropolis while fighting fighting General Zod and the other Kryptonians. People were kind of horrified by seeing Superman basically knock down buildings while fighting these guys with no attention paid to the civilians on the street. So that becomes a focus of Batman v Superman. That film opens, and what I actually still think is maybe its smartest choice. That movie opens with Bruce Wayne on the streets of Metropolis with civilians watching this happen from a ground level perspective. And it goes from there. I mean, the new cut of we're not going to talk a lot about Snyder's cut of Justice League on the show today, because we actually have a bonus episode this week. So if you're interested in hearing about more of our thoughts on the Snyder cut, on Zack Snyder's Justice League, you can find that in the bonus cut. But I would mention that his movie opens with a reiteration of the end of Batman v Superman. So he's already, I mean, it really is kind of a trilogy within this larger franchise.
Yeah, and not only that, but the other films in this franchise sort of take their cues from that in a lot of ways, understandably so. I mean, we've mentioned before the Suicide Squad, right? That was a film that was, sort of famously, David Ayer, its writer-director, has come out and publicly said the film that he shot was basically the first draft that he wrote, and that it ended up being recut because of the trailer. The first trailer that they put out, people were such fans of it that he was sort of told, they love that so much, go back and make it more of that, please. And that's been the case for these other films in the DCEU as well. I
actually think in the case of Suicide Squad, there was a little bit of indirect Marvel influence as well, because I see the way that some of that movie is cut and how. I mean, I think the trailer for that movie is reflecting the trailer for Guardians of the Galaxy. I think that it's very much like, this is the kind of movie we want to make here. And I don't think it's an accident that that James Gunn, director of the first two Guardians of the Galaxy film, when he was briefly fired from Marvel, he was brought on to do the Suicide Squad sequel. Yeah,
absolutely. So, and not only that, but those films, right? Once Suicide Squad came out and had the, I guess maybe polarizing response would be a polite way of saying it. But, the next films in this series are, given the response to Suicide Squad and Batman v Superman, you see Wonder Woman and Justice League, the subsequent films very much taking a sharp turn away from those, precisely, I think, in reaction to them, because they had gotten such negative responses from large parts of the audience that they were, the DC sort of said, okay, well then we gotta try something else here.
We need more levity, basically. Like, people like that in the Marvel movies. They don't like how serious the DC movies are. So we need more levity. And from there, what you saw, honestly, was after Justice League, the Joss Whedon cut of Justice League in 2017, after that was a critical and largely a box office failure, you could already see DC pivoting again and course correcting. And you could see them thinking, well, Wonder Woman was actually a huge success for us. Why not back off a little bit from this shared universe plan and think of these things more as their own animal, because Aquaman and Shazam are both kind of their own thing. They feel less beholden to the kind of look and feel that Snyder set up with his films.
Yeah, like who would have thought that letting movies be their own movie might be a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I would love to see that in Marvel as well. I would love if these things didn't have to. My big critique of Marvel films is that they often play like advertisements for the next film in the series. It's just like, it's constantly just stringing us along, which is a very comic strategy in its own way. It's like, buy the next issue, read next week, Yeah,
it is though. But yeah, I think that's why, like, you and I know very often we'll talk about the things that we most like in any Marvel movie is usually however distinctive it is from the other ones.
Which isn't a great sign, because a lot of Marvel movies, even when they have directors who have distinctive personalities, visual or conceptual personalities, often that ends up at the very best, sort of having a stalemate with the formula of the franchise. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's very true. So, but I think that you see that in, I think especially, like you said, those later ones. Shazam is another great example of, the DCEU sort of saying, well, we've really got to let these movies sort of stand on their own, and they can reference the fact that they exist in this universe, but we want to pull these out and let them be their own thing. Aquaman as well. I mean, Aquaman is nothing like any of the other DCEU films either.
Right, has a totally different tone and a different look as well. Although I still think that even something like Wonder Woman to me felt like DC saying we can tiptoe a little out of this house style, but we're still kind of in it because I have mixed feelings about that film. But one thing I really don't like is that I do feel like the ending basically devolves into Snyder's idea of how this action should look. You know?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it does sort of for a movie that I think so successfully, I think for a large part of its running time, sort of bucks the trend of what is expected from the action maybe of a comic book movie. It really does devolve into another sort of CGI light show for its finale,
which is just such a drag,
Yeah, it is.
I mean, I keep saying this as though I'm like trying to. I'm trying to also piss off Marvel fans. Well, we piss off DC fans, but I often don't like the action in Marvel films either. But
yeah, I mean, I mean, there's basically if at the end of the movie your heroes are fighting like a giant CGI hole in the sky, you've done something wrong.
It's a problem.
Yeah.
For sure. So I don't want to go through each of these individually. We're not going to run the series this thing here. I would like to talk though a little bit maybe about Man of Steel, because I do feel like the whole foundation of this franchise is built on this movie, and again in a way that I think DC has retroactively regretted. Obviously, I think that they would maybe have preferred it struck a different tone at the beginning. It's still a little crazy to me that Snyder got the keys to the castle. He had made some major hits, or he had made at least one major hit, which was 300. But at that point, he was not. I mean, after 300, he did Watchmen, and Watchmen had not been really a hit, and he made that Owls movie that they make fun of on 30 Rock, and that was a flop.
Yeah, it really is kind of startling, especially, I've always found, especially in the wake of Watchmen, to sort of give him the keys to the DC kingdom was fascinating. Because, I mean, Watchmen was, let's be frank, like, Watchmen was not well received by and large. It's not a very good film. It's not a very good adaptation, it's not a very good adaptation of a comic property, and B, not a very good film in and of itself. So to then say to that guy, oh, you should be running all of our properties, like you should be the architect behind all of our, all of these franchises going forward in the DCEU is kind of astounding.
All I can think really is that he had a really confident vision for it or something. I mean, DC's coming off of the Nolan films. It's sort of looking, what is our path forward? And, Snyder comes in 2010, I think, is when he came on to... he first started discussions with Warner Brothers and with DC about it. So at that point, Marvel is already sort of in full swing. They've had a couple of big hits. And so DC is sort of looking what's their path forward. And I will say this for Snyder. I think he does have a vision and he does have an idea. I don't always like his idea, and I particularly don't like his conception of Superman. But it's an idea. I guarantee he came and said, this is what I want to do with this character. And it was probably a coherent idea about what he wanted to do with him.
He seems like a guy who would absolutely crush a pitch meeting.
Yeah.
Because and we'll talk about this a little more as we discuss Man of Steel. But I mean, he is nothing if not a distinctive visual stylist, right? His movies look like his movies, and so there's a sense that if he comes in with sort of some imagery and a strong, confident pitch and a coherent vision of where he wants to go, I could see being impressed by it.
Oh yeah, and I kind of wonder how much of that first trailer for Man of Steel was in his initial pitch to the studio. Because do you remember the trailer for Man of Steel?
Refresh my memory.
It's very short. I mean, it's almost like the first teaser for the film. And it has this voiceover about how Superman is going to be the light of the world, and they will They will fear him at first, but eventually they will join him in the light. And all of his sort of Terrence Malick affectations that are in that film are in that trailer. And it's stirring as fuck. Like, it looks like a mythic and interesting take on Superman.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And it ends right with that sort of famous line about the symbol that looks like the S, and he says it's actually symbolizes hope, right?
Yeah, I think so. And then we see him fly off into the sky. It's a really savvy piece of marketing, that trailer. And at its best, I think that Man of Steel has moments that suggest what a great Zack Snyder Superman movie could look like, because there is stuff in that first movie that I do quite like. I think the performances are pretty good. I think that both Kevin Costner and Russell Crowe, as his I guess you'd say his dueling father figures, the two influences on him as a man, I think they're both quite good. I like its style occasionally, at least when I actually do really like when it's kind of being blockbuster Terrence Malick, when we're seeing Superman walk through fields, or when he's out there, the kind of handheld stuff when he's out there working on that rig, and it has a really, really great score. Like that sweeping Superman score, when that came in watching the Snyder's cut of Justice League, when he uses that score again in that, I felt the movie that this could have been. You know what I mean? That's a good way of putting it. Is that there's a lot to suggest what it could have been, right? You can see the edges of a great movie in the grain of Snyder's film, right? That Man of Steel is. You can see, because I agree with you. I think a lot of the maybe bombastic moments, the action I can sort of take or leave for the most part, but some of the bombast of the imagery and the way that he sort of frames, Superman, like you said, on the rig, or I think of, when he's first landing in the Arctic to, his, the Fortress of Solitude. There's so many moments that feel appropriately epic in scale and feel like they go along with what Superman should be, which is precisely this sort of larger than life figure who nonetheless is figuring out the humanity inside him. Yeah, but then you start getting into is the tricky stuff with his values. And the thing is that I'm not so attached to Superman as a character that I don't think we can't have revisionist takes. We've had revisionist takes before, in fact. Something like Red Son, where famously Kal-El lands in Soviet Russia and is raised in Soviet Russia instead of America. There are interesting takes on this character, and there are interesting ones that touch on him as this kind of figure who can very easily shade into fascism, into some Ubermensch's idea of the perfect perfect human specimen or something. But that's not this movie. It's not. I mean, there are elements of that, and I think just what bothers me the most about this is that it's a version of Superman who really seems to have a pretty fluctuating respect for human life. Yeah. Which that's really far afield with Superman. That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, it's the fluctuating nature of the characterization of him. It would be one thing if it felt very established and you got a really good sense of who he was and what he cared about. But largely, he just seems like a mope. He goes through so much of the film just kind of like not wanting to be Superman and shucking around and being bummed out by things, and you can't tell really to what degree he cares about the people around him, to what degree he doesn't. He does these heroic things now and again, but he doesn't seem to be especially happy about it. It's not very fun to watch. Well, and I don't know if we can blame him for not always necessarily understanding that, like, his role as a protector of mankind, which has been the notion around Superman from the start, because his father in the film, and this to me is the most baffling choice in the whole film, and I've never been able to get over it. And I get that. I know exactly what you're going to say. You know where I'm going with this. I think people who defend this film would probably say it's an interesting choice. I found it a disturbing one. Kevin Costner, who plays his father, the sort of voice of reason and sort of responsible for his moral code. He is the film's moral compass. He is the film's moral compass. He says at one point during a flashback scene where young Clark basically saves all his classmates from a bus crash, he basically says to him, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't have done that. Like, maybe your secret identity is more important than the lives of those kids. And that is really far afield from what I think people like about Superman and value about that character. And it speaks to like, I'm not surprised that a Superman who had a father who said that to him as a kid would end his film, his big starring vehicle, basically making out on ground zero. Because that is sort of how the movie ends. Like, he has destroyed Metropolis, and him and Lois Lane are making out on the fucking rubble. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that speaks volumes to where the sensibilities of that movie end up lying, which is in this sort of muddled place of, you know, where it's supposed to be noble just in and of because of the fact that it's Superman. That, you know, the sort of weight of the character is supposed to carry you along through these things that I think would be really troubling if it was anybody else doing it.
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah. So let me ask you this: what do you think these films do? I'm gonna start with the negative on this one, but I'm gonna say, what do you think these films do worse than their Marvel counterparts?
I mean, the main thing that I think they do worse than their counterpart is they and I did sort of mention this just now, but they're just, by and large, they're less fun. You know, Marvel, for all the criticisms I think you and I share about its sort of factory formula approach to movie making, they know what's entertaining, and they know how to supply that. You know, that there's a sort of sense of joy and a sense of warmth and appeal to the movie. You know, they actually, it reminds me of Pixar in some ways. That, you know, they've got a really good sense of how to craft characters that you can relate to, you empathize with, that you feel happy when they're happy, you're sad when they're sad. You get almost none of that from these DCEU films, at least until the later ones, right? You see them starting to try and chase that formula later on, but especially in the Zack Snyder movies, there's not much to enjoy about. Even at the times when I can respect and even admire the films, I don't really enjoy them.
No, they're not fun. I mean, they are these big lead-footed things, you know, and they take. I don't have a huge problem with taking comic book stuff seriously. I also think that it's always. I said this when Joker came out. I think how seriously you take the film is your choice. You don't have to take it as seriously as the filmmaker to get something out of it, you know? So you can watch these films, Snyder's films, and take them less seriously than he takes them and still have a good time maybe. I just don't know how much it's a little baffling to me to approach these characters and not think about how they can make them entertaining. And I also just think there's no genuine heroism in a lot of his portrayal of these characters. They seem they are serious. They are like curiously self-involved superheroes. You know,
that's a good way of putting it.
Not self-involved in the Tony Stark way, where he's somebody who is wrestling with it. Self-involved in the sense that they genuinely seem to understand that they are superior to the average person. You know? And not only that, but they don't. Their concern for the average person is middling at best. Even when they try to be explicitly about that. I mean, Batman v Superman structures itself, as you said, explicitly as a reaction to, you know, Man of Steel's sort of seeming lack of regard for innocent human life. Batman never seems like he really gives a shit about any of the people he's trying to save. Well, this is a Batman who brands his insignia on criminals knowing that they will be killed in prison. So he doesn't care that much about people either. And the fact of the matter is that the arc of Batman v Superman is not Superman coming to realize that Batman's right about the collateral damage and right about what he's done. It's about Batman coming around to Superman's idea, which is kind of insane to me. Like you would think in the end, maybe Superman, like if this is the arc of your series, maybe it turns into Superman realizing and accepting his responsibility in a way that he couldn't quite in the first film. But it doesn't go in that direction. If anything, it just turns into Batman realizing that this version of Superman, the one that already exists, is the world does need him. You know?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it's not even... I mean, I would even go a step further and say these movies could be about each of them coming to realize the value in the other's sort of perspective. But that doesn't happen at all. I mean, as has been sort of famously mocked, right? At the end of Batman v Superman. Spoiler alert for people who have not yet seen Batman v Superman. But, you know, it rests on this sort of parlor trick of them both realizing their moms have the same first name, which is about the most, you know, the least compelling way to get these people on each other's side that I could imagine.
Can you imagine Snyder discovering that, just the look of light that I think of like biopics where a musician comes up with the idea for a song or something. Can you imagine him realizing that in the comics their mothers had the same name? He must have that was like a gift to him, But you're right. It's a shorthand, though. You're right. Instead of trying to find a place where these two characters might see eye to eye, or to sort of create a common ground between them, it just uses this family connection thing that they both have mothers with the same name, and it just uses that as a way to resolve their conflict.
Yeah, it's a cheap shortcut. Like I don't even there's a world in which that Martha moment could have landed and worked just fine. It's that the movie isn't willing to do the work, the characterization work, to build the conflict and figure out how to resolve it in a way that's organic.
Yeah, agreed. But let me ask you this: what do these films do better than their Marvel counterparts?
All right. Well, I think this. We've talked a little about this already, but It's pretty obvious, right? They have, for better or worse, these are films made by directors that are recognizably their own. They aren't trying to shoehorn them into one particular mold. They're letting each character sort of breathe on their own and be their own thing, and they're letting the movie around these characters fill out according to the personalities, personas, and stories that they have to tell. Which that's what I want from superhero movies. I'm not let's be clear. I think that's great, and so when I go to see a DCEU film, I'm always excited to see what I think is actually going to be a movie that does right by the character and story it's going to tell. It's not going to try and just give me the same thing I've already seen a dozen times before.
Very much so, and a lot of them have moments that feel distinctive to their own filmmakers. I think of most recently, obviously, Kathy Yan's Birds of Prey feels very much like a distinct vision within this world. It's adhering to the sort of general template of the franchise, but it definitely very much has its own visual comic personality. But even something like Aquaman, there's that whole horror sequence in Aquaman that's very much like, oh yeah, James Wan made this,
yeah, absolutely. And Aquaman, I think, is a great example too, because part of what I enjoy about Aquaman is that it's so, it just takes everything that's big and ridiculous and silly about superhero movies, and it embraces it and cranks it up to 11 and says, oh, you want ridiculous over the top? Here you go, and it doesn't try to be self-serious in any way, shape, or form, and I found it so refreshing for that.
Yeah. I would say that the thing that I really prefer about them to the Marvel films is that it's not just that they have their own stylistic personality. It's that I actually do think that a lot of the time, and this includes Snyder, and maybe especially Snyder in this case, they do seem to get the visual appeal of comics in a way that the Marvel films do not. I've enjoyed action scenes in the Marvel films, and a few of them manage to occasionally graze a great action scene in the comics medium. I think of the big tarmac fight in Civil War, for example. I think has a lot of that is made in a way that captures the appeal of comics. But I think Snyder, much more than anybody in the Marvel universe, is somebody who gets he gets the splash panel appeal of comic books. He knows how to make these characters look cool. I wish he knew how to give them more soul, but he at least knows how to get a great looking image here and there. And a lot of his action will often devolve into CGI sludge too. But on a whole, I think that it's more coherent and more interesting to look at than the action in a lot of Marvel films.
Yeah, he's one of those people where you can sort of really see the roots showing in terms of, sort of music video directing, right? Where he's somebody who's so good at sort of capturing iconic images and pairing sound and image together in a way that, makes it more than the sum of its parts, which, let's be frank, is something the Marvel movies often struggle to do. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Where would you like to see the DC franchise go from here?
I gotta say, in general, I'm a fan of the direction they've been going in. As much as I don't always love the individual movies, I've enjoyed the fact that they are individual movies. I like that the DC is sort of letting itself be less reliant upon the shared interconnected universe. So I kind of want to see it continue down that path. I want to see them get even more distinctive, like give me a good Green Lantern movie, that has nothing to do with the Justice League. Give me stuff like that where it's just, it's its own thing. Hire, interesting directors, and then instead of shoving them into some sort of DCEU mold akin to Marvel, let them put their own visual and aesthetic stamp on these movies.
Yeah, I mean, the success that they achieved with Nolan was partially because they said, you're a filmmaker who has a vision for this world, go with it,
Yeah.
Now, the money has to be there and the success has to be there, but take some shots on some filmmakers and let them do something that doesn't feel the need. Just, I honestly, stop trying to emulate Marvel and do your own thing, I think.
Yeah, and if you look at the recent ones, it seems to be working for them. You look at the huge, Aquaman was a massive success. Shazam was successful enough. It seems to be working.
What I would love to see, too, is I would love to see these movies reinvest in the villain in a way that I feel like a lot of them have not. I've liked some of the DCU villains. I guess the one I've liked the most, actually, is just, believe it or not, is Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor. I actually thought he was a lone sort of beacon of fun in that movie. I know lots of people don't like that performance. I think he's a blast in that. I would love to see these movies because obviously you and I were a lot younger when there were DC movies around, like the Batman films, for example, Burton's Batman films, and then later Schumacher's. Those films possibly took it a little bit too far in the opposite direction in the sense that they were sort of making the villains the whole show.
Yeah.
But at the same time, maybe course correct back in that direction a little bit because, we're living in an age of comic book cinema. I don't think we're necessarily living in an age of great comic book villains on screen.
Yeah, that's a fair way of putting it. Yeah, and you see this in Marvel too, right? This isn't a problem that's limited to DC.
It's not.
Everybody seems to be struggling with the villains, and so I agree. I would like to see, if you don't have to straight up give us, a villain movie, but take a little more time with them. Don't just make them the anonymous mushmen of Suicide Squad.
Yeah, or Steppenwolf. It was like the most generic. Honestly, you could switch Steppenwolf out with the elf bad guy in the second Thor movie, and nobody would. It would be no effect. It would be no effect.
That is absolutely true, which is so sad.
Yep. Okay, so least favorite of the DCU films. Go.
I think I have to go with Suicide Squad. That movie is just such a mess. I think you agree with me on this, right?
I do. I do think that movie has a few striking images in it, and I actually like a couple of the performances in it. But it is close to incoherent, and it is a film that just never stops starting. Yeah. And that one, even more so than Justice League, I feel like you can just see the degree to which this thing has been reworked to death.
Yeah, a superhero movie that introduces its characters twice and one of them even 3 times. I just when he admitted that was a first draft, never before have I more agreed. Yes, this plays like a first draft of a movie.
Totally.
I will say, for as bad as that one is, I really do actually quite dislike the theatrical, whatever you want to call it, canonical cut of Justice League as well.
Okay.
I think it's easily the worst thing Joss Whedon's ever been associated with. But it just
not the worst thing, Alex. Okay. I would say it is the worst.
The worst piece of media.
Yes. There you go.
That he's ever been involved with. That it's the definition of too many cooks trying desperately to add 100 different flavors and ending up with just this sort of mess of stew and half cooked ideas.
And you don't like the new Wonder Woman film either.
Yeah, the new Wonder Woman film I think suffers a little from that to a degree too. It's a case of trying to do too much with too little. I thought the first Wonder Woman film was so great that it was a bit dispiriting to see them sort of try and, it reminded me a bit in some ways of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3, where it's just trying to shove way too much into a single movie. And as a result, you end up doing justice to almost none of it.
Yeah, it's an insane film in some ways. I mean, I just really was not expecting one of the main touchstones of influence for the film to be the Wishmaster series. There's a lot of wishing in that film, which is very strange. I will say that there are elements of the second Wonder Woman that I enjoyed. I actually do like both of the villains in that. I think they're both kind of fun.
I think Kristen Wiig in particular is actually pretty. I really enjoyed, for the most part, all of Kristen Wiig's stuff in it. I would have liked to have seen more of her, or even just having her be the sole villain. I think would have been interesting as well.
It's a total mess, but I think it does have some. There are moments of crazed inspiration in it that I sort of enjoyed just how much they went for it in that one, in terms of like, this is pure comic book silliness.
Yeah, and you see some of that in some of the performances too. I mean, I think Chris Pine, I think again really shows that when you let that guy be funny, he really brings it.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so favorite of the DCEU films?
I'm gonna go with Shazam.
Okay.
I have a real fondness for Shazam. I think some of this maybe is precisely what we were talking about, of just letting these films be their own thing. And that movie, that is a character and a story and a superhero that is so geared towards this sort of broad, family-friendly, sort of silly, goofy, embracing everything that's sort of fun and childlike and exciting about superheroes. And just letting it breathe on screen and letting us all letting the audience sort of participate in what an adrenaline rush it must be to actually get powers like that. And I think the film just does a really good job of doing that. It's not, I don't think it's great art by any stretch of the imagination, but it's so satisfyingly fun and enjoyable. And it reminds you of, like, to me, it really did hit those pleasure centers of like touching that childlike part of you that reminds you what a gleeful thing superheroes should be sometimes.
Yeah, and I will say this too, that that Zack McLevy in the title role is a ton of fun in a way that I don't think we've seen from this franchise on a whole, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just this idea of I mean, it's basically the Tom Hanks movie Big, except that the character is a superhero. But that's a reliable formula, I think, in some respects. And I did really enjoy his take, even if I think that his version of the character is more like a 10-year-old than the 13-year-old he's supposed to be, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I didn't have too much of a problem with it, but I think that's an absolutely valid criticism.
Yeah. So if I can't say parts of Man of Steel, because honestly that would probably be my answer, is I do think there are majestic moments in Man of Steel and elements of it that I really do like. If my answer can't be the score of Man of Steel, I guess I would probably go with Birds of Prey, which I do really think has its own personality. It's kind of it's sort of funhouse energy. I found sort of infectious. I don't think any of these films are perfect or even entirely successful, and I think that one has plenty of its own problems. But I do really enjoy its energy and its performances, and it restores a degree of fun to this franchise that I didn't think that this world was really. I mean, it's almost like this thing like goes back towards the. It's like it course corrects so far away from the grimdark of Snyder's version that it's almost getting back into the Schumacher side of it, And,
that's a good way of putting it. And also, I also don't think it's a coincidence that our two favorites that we mentioned both sort of depend very, rest largely upon knockout lead performances by their stars.
Very much so. Agreed.
So I will say though, I do want to mention though, because and this sounds like a sop to the DC people who are angry at us right now, but I've actually found myself occasionally revisiting a film that I know you by and large just really don't enjoy, which is Batman v Superman, and in the same way that I think you find yourself sort of drawn to some of Man of Steel. I find myself fascinated by, and let me make clear here that I'm talking about the extended director's cut of Batman v Superman, not the shortened theatrical version, which I agree is actually quite bad in almost every way. But the longer film, which, is much more of Zack Snyder's obvious vision, I think there's just a lot of interesting, weird, fascinating choices he's making there, and some that I find so compelling, even when I can sort of objectively stand back from it and say, this is not good filmmaking or this is not good storytelling. It's so striking at times that it really, I find myself weirdly drawn to it. That's it for this edition of Film Club. Thanks a lot for listening. If you're enjoying it, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by special guest Alex McLevy. It was produced and edited by Carl Blomberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Zach Goldsboro, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. And if you'd like to hear more about Zack Snyder's Justice League, Alex and I talk about that on a very special bonus episode of the show. It's also available wherever you get your podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. Thanks.
Bye-bye.